He folded the same corner of the blanket twice this morning, as if symmetry could undo last night. The room still carried that heavy scent of cedarwood and unspoken decisions. I didn't step back when his sleeve brushed mine at the sink. I let the heat stay. The windowsill where we used to leave teacups now felt like a secret neither of us dared move. I wasn't mistaken or misled. I was awake and I stayed. I used to think I was good at being alone. Not noble, not tragic, just efficient. I made lists, folded sheets with surgical precision, kept my mugs lined up like soft little guards against chaos. I even chose silence over noise, not because it was peaceful, but because it was predictable. And yet, nothing prepares you for the way a person can walk back into your life and rearrange the furniture of your memory, without touching a single thing. It was late March, the kind that still clings to winter, but flirts with spring just enough to make you forget your coat. The air around the house felt old, soaked in the smell of wet wood and tea bags left too long in the pot. The doorbell didn't ring. It never worked. He knocked twice, sharp, decisive, and I knew it was him before I opened it. Jules. He stood there in a jacket too thin for the wind, hair damp from the drive, a duffel bag slung across one shoulder like a reluctant apology. He didn't smile, just raised his chin a fraction and said, "Viola." Not Mom. Not even Vi. It landed flat, soft, but with a finality that echoed across the years we hadn't spoken. I hadn't seen him in nearly a decade. Not since the last summer before his father and I split for good, when Jules still left crumbs in the toaster and called me Nuoina. Back then I brushed his hair for him before school. I taught him how to press linen with a cloth between the iron. I wiped tears once when he tripped at the greenhouse steps. And now there he was, taller, older, with something tired in the corners of his mouth that didn't belong to youth anymore. He said he needed a few weeks. "City's too loud," he muttered. "Just needed somewhere with less noise." I didn't ask what happened. Or who. I nodded. Let him in. That first night passed like someone walking barefoot across an old wooden floor, carefully knowing which planks might creak. I made roasted lentils and oversteamed broccoli. He didn't complain. Just ate slowly, looking not at me, but somewhere between the table and the window where the fog had begun to settle. We didn't talk much and that was fine. I asked if he wanted chamomile. He said no. I poured it anyway, placed it near him without meeting his eyes. He took it, fingers grazing mine for half a second. Skin on skin, just the edge of a knuckle, but I felt it burn like something unsaid. Later, while washing the cups, I watched him from the kitchen archway. He sat with one leg tucked under the other, flipping through a book from my shelf, one I didn't even know I still had. The lamplight hit his collarbone in a way that made it look like sculpture. Still, measured, quietly waiting. He didn't speak, just turned a page, slow enough that I wondered if he was reading, or just remembering how silence used to fill this house. The cat rubbed against his ankle. He didn't flinch. There was something off about the way he sat there, like the room had bent around him slightly, allowing his presence to reshape it. And I realized in that moment that I'd never seen him as a man before. I'd seen him as a boy, a guest, a question mark attached to another person's past. But now, under this thin yellow light, with one sock slightly rolled down and the scent of citrus shampoo still lingering in his damp hair, he wasn't just someone's son anymore. He was something unnamed. I should have gone to bed. I even told myself to. But my feet lingered at the base of the stairs, listening to the subtle creak of the old radiator warming up behind the bookshelf. I told myself I was waiting for the kettle to finish. I told myself the mug in my hand still needed rinsing. When he finally stood to stretch, our eyes met, through the reflection of the window, not directly. That glassy barrier softened his face, like a memory seen from the wrong end of a telescope. He didn't smile, just held the glance one breath too long. Long enough for my fingers to tighten involuntarily around the ceramic handle. I went upstairs without turning off the lamp. Not because I forgot, because part of me wanted to know if he'd leave it on too. That night I slept with my socks on and the window barely open, but I still woke up cold. Some days blurred. Some nights stayed. There was no line drawn between what we meant to do and what we allowed. Only repetition, gentle, careful, unspoken. Jules had a way of entering a room like he'd always been there. No sound, no announcement. Just warmth following him like smoke from wet firewood. Every morning he'd leave the kitchen light dim. Just enough glow to find the kettle. Just enough shadow to stay quiet. He started bringing the red wool scarf from the hallway peg and wrapping it around my shoulders before I sat. Once. Then again. Then again. By the fourth morning I didn't flinch when I felt it tighten at my neck. I adjusted it slightly, but only after he walked away. He never tied it in a knot. Just let it drape. Like a promise that didn't want to be too sure of itself. The scarf wasn't the only thing that stayed too long. There was the Chopin piece, Nocturne in E-flat, that kept playing on repeat, always around the same hour. I never told him I noticed. He never asked if I minded. And yet, there it was, floating through the house like a thought neither of us wanted to claim. He started fixing things. The curtain rod. The stuck window hinge in the study. He polished the glass of my reading lamp like it mattered. Like it was part of me. Once, while I was reading on the sofa, he reached over to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. I didn't stop him. But I didn't thank him either. His fingertips brushed the page I was holding. Not to turn it. Just to trace a word. He said, "This sentence feels like it's hiding something." I replied, "The best ones always do." He looked at me a beat longer than he should have, then went back to the dishes. At night we watched films we'd both already seen. He chose the floor but always near. Legs stretched just far enough that sometimes, just sometimes, his knee met mine. He never moved it away. Neither did I. The contact wasn't persistent. But it was expected. Like breath on a window pane. Fleeting but real. He asked me one evening, as we stood on the porch watching rain soak the brick path, "Do you miss being held?" I should have laughed. Or changed the subject. Instead I said, "I miss not noticing that I miss it." He said nothing. But I felt his eyes rest on my temple, just long enough for my throat to tighten. The nights got colder. The room smaller. He started checking if I turned the heater on before going to bed. "Do you want ginger tea?" "Only if you're making it," I said once without thinking. His smile didn't reach his eyes, but the way he placed the cup on the table, closer than usual, made me notice the tremor in my fingers. I watched his hands often, not for their shape but for their silence. He moved like someone who'd learned not to be a burden, but hadn't quite unlearned wanting to be wanted. There were pauses now, between what we said and what we didn't, between setting down a fork and standing too close in the hallway. One night, I passed by the living room and saw the scarf folded on the arm of the chair. Still warm. I picked it up, pressed it to my lips. It smelled like wood smoke, tea, and something faintly citrus, something that didn't belong to memory. Not yet. If I asked myself then what it all meant, I would have said, nothing. But that wasn't true. Not when the curtains had started staying half open. Not when my skin remembered every accidental brush as if it had been written down. Sometimes his elbow would graze mine while reaching for a spoon. He'd murmur, "Sorry," and I'd reply, "You're not." And neither of us would correct it. The house didn't grow quieter, only more careful. Each sound, a drawer sliding, a mug placed gently on the sink, began to feel like choreography. Every step rehearsed but unacknowledged. Like we were living inside a shared draft neither of us dared edit. The power went out just after 10. There was a low groan from the wind pressing against the roof tiles, followed by a crack of wood somewhere deep in the bones of the house. I stood still in the hallway, one hand on the banister, the other fumbling for the flashlight drawer I never managed to organize. And then from behind the darkness, came his voice, calm, unhurried, close. "You okay in there?" I didn't answer right away. My throat had gone dry, not from fear, but from the kind of quiet that feels too intimate to interrupt. Moments later, he appeared at the threshold of my room, a lit candle in one hand, the same wool scarf in the other. He didn't ask if he could enter. He just did. The flame flickered across his cheekbones, tracing light down the center of his throat. He placed the candle on my desk without a word, then stepped closer and held the scarf out, not like an offering, more like a habit. "I thought you'd be cold," he said low. I didn't take it from him. Instead, I stood very still and let him wrap it around me himself. His fingers brushed my collarbone once, unintentionally or not. He lingered, adjusting it just slightly longer than necessary. I could feel the heat from his breath, not on my skin but in the air between us. It tightened something in me I hadn't named in years. When I sat on the edge of the bed, he crouched beside me. The wind outside moaned through the chimney. Shadows on the wall stretched and folded with every flick of the flame. I felt the mattress dip ever so slightly when he shifted his weight, and then, without looking at me, he reached out and placed his hand over mine. It wasn't a grasp. It was an anchor. A reminder. His palm was warm, dry, steady. Mine was trembling ever so slightly. He noticed. I felt him breathe in as if steadying for me. "Why does silence feel louder when it's shared?" he asked, his voice low like a secret being tested. I didn't know how to answer. I only turned slightly and let my shoulder lean into his. We stayed like that, not speaking, not adjusting. My head settled against him naturally, like it had always known the shape of that shoulder. There was no music. No television. Only the sound of two lungs sinking in a room that had forgotten how to be neutral. He turned just enough to look at me. I didn't turn away. His hand came up slow and touched my face. Not to move it, not to pull me closer, but to rest. He placed his fingers gently on my cheek, and it was as if the whole house held its breath. I closed my eyes. It wasn't desire. Not in the way it's often spoken. It was recognition. Like being remembered by your own skin. I don't remember who moved first. Maybe no one did. Maybe the moment moved us. But our foreheads met lightly. Then our noses. Then the space between us vanished. Not in a rush, but in the way a sigh leaves the body when it's been held too long. His lips touched mine once. Soft. Undemanding. Not a question, not a claim. Just a statement: we were here. There was no urgency. Only a tenderness so unfamiliar it felt like grief. I remember thinking, so this is what it means to be seen, even if only for a moment you shouldn't keep. When it ended, we didn't speak. He pulled back first, not far, just enough. I opened my eyes. He didn't. Then, like nothing had happened, he stood, took the candle and walked out. I didn't stop him. I didn't follow. I just lay back slowly, the scarf still around my neck, the warmth of him still pressed into the curve of my spine. The ceiling above me looked different. Same cracks, same yellowed edges. But something had shifted. Like the air had learned a secret it wouldn't share. The scarf was the first thing I noticed. Not around my shoulders, not on the hook by the door. It lay folded, wrongly, on the armchair in the hallway. Lopsided, like a question no one wanted to fix. The Chopin still played at 8, but it sounded thinner. Like the notes were reaching through something viscous. Or maybe I was the one drifting. Jules hadn't said a word when he came in. He didn't say morning like he used to. Just pushed the teacup toward me with the back of his hand, as if I might flinch from the palm. He sat farther down the table. Not too far to be rude. Just far enough to not smell my perfume. Outside, the wind scraped at the old shutters like it wanted to be let in. Inside, the silence pressed harder. Not heavy, just deliberate. We talked about safe things. The news. A cold front moving in from the north. Something about trains resuming after the mudslides. Nothing about how my hand had rested on his chest only 2 nights before. Nothing about how I had not wanted to move it. He didn't look at me for more than 2 seconds at a time. His gaze slid across the room, never anchoring. Even when I dropped a spoon, and the sound startled both of us, he didn't meet my eyes. Just bent down, picked it up, handed it back, then wiped his fingers on his jeans. He always used to place the scarf over my shoulders before I stepped outside. That morning he didn't. I waited 5 seconds longer by the door than necessary, then opened it myself. The scarf stayed limp on the chair like it was tired of being useful. When I came back from the garden, I saw him in the kitchen through the glass. His hand wiping the same part of the counter over and over. He wasn't cleaning. He was stalling. Later, I caught him adjusting the curtains in the living room. But he didn't glance at me. The sunlight hit his cheekbone just right, and for a second in the blur of the window's reflection, I thought I saw the boy he used to be. The one who asked me to check his essay draft at midnight, who once fell asleep with his head on my lap during a storm. He was retreating. I knew the signs. The excessive tidiness. The clipped answers. The way he left his cup on the wrong side of the sink, like someone preparing not to be missed. That evening he packed a book into his bag. Not the one he was reading, but the one I'd once lent him when he was 15. A battered edition of Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. I stood at the doorframe holding a dish towel still damp. I almost asked why he took that one, but I didn't. I just watched the spine disappear between folded shirts. The scarf hadn't moved. It just watched us both. He didn't stay for the whole nocturne that night. The music played without him, off balance, one side of the stereo quieter than the other. I sat alone in the chair, knees pulled up, as the shadows bent and thinned on the walls. No one reached to tuck the throw blanket under my feet. No voice asked, "Are you cold?" In the kitchen, the light blinked twice, then settled into a dull orange. When I passed the hallway, I brushed my fingers against the scarf. It didn't respond, just held the temperature of wood and silence, as if it had already forgotten the warmth it once wrapped, as if we'd made it all up, in a night no one would admit happened. The wind rose again. I closed the curtains, but not all the way. Sometimes I wanted the dark to know I was still awake. In the chair, I lowered myself slowly, bone by bone. My hand drifted to the armrest, touched the groove where his elbow used to rest when he sat too close. Cold. I touched the armrest where the old scarf used to lie. Cold. As if that night had only borrowed someone else's warmth. I found him in the hallway, crouched beside the old bookshelf, fingering the frayed edge of my notebook like it might tear if touched wrong. He didn't speak right away. Just let the silence stretch, deliberate but not cruel. "I'll forget it," he said eventually, not looking up. "If that makes it easier." I stood still. My hands were damp from washing the mugs we hadn't used. A strange impulse made me dry them again. "I don't want to forget," I replied. "I just don't know where to keep it. It doesn't fit anywhere." There was no echo to my words. No soft music in the background. Only the low hum of the refrigerator and the rustle of wind through a crack in the window. Even the house seemed unsure how to respond. He gave a small nod. Barely there. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. The kind you give to things that can't be helped. Later I saw him reading my poem. The one I had written 15 years ago, the week Daniel left. I never meant for anyone to read it. I never meant to read it again myself. He didn't ask for permission. "A hand can leave without slamming," he read. "A body can ache without bruising. But silence, God's silence claws from the inside." His voice didn't shake. But I did. I waited for the usual recoil, shame, defense, some instinct to reclaim privacy. But it never came. Only breath. And then stillness. No one said sorry. We sat across from each other that evening, a book between us neither of us touched. I glanced at his hands. They rested open on his knees, as if they'd been emptied. Dinner was quiet. Not out of discomfort. More like reverence. The kind of quiet you offer to things on the edge of fading. He packed early the next morning. I watched him from the hallway mirror. His back turned, shoulders tight. He folded each shirt as if memorizing its lines. He always packed like that, intentional, almost ceremonial. "I'll head back tonight," he said. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask if he'd come again. We both knew the answer didn't belong to either of us. But before he left, he returned to the room. He didn't say a word. Just placed the scarf, his scarf, on the edge of my bed. Folded. Aligned. Like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence we didn't know how to finish. After the door closed, I stared at it for longer than I cared to admit. I kept thinking it might open again, even though I knew he hated forgetting things. Which meant he would never come back just to pretend it hadn't happened. The scarf still held his warmth. Not just from his hands but from something subtler like breath or memory. I didn't wear it. That would have been too much. Instead, I let it lie there all afternoon. A presence that didn't demand anything. I turned off the Chopin that had started automatically. The keys sounded strained, like a voice cracking mid-sentence. I didn't realize how much the music had become background until it felt out of place. The house wasn't quieter without him. It was clearer. I made tea. 2 cups. Habit again. And then sat by the window, even though the wind had picked up again and the air bit at my skin. He hadn't taken anything. Not the book he left by the chair. Not the sweater that had slipped behind the couch. Not even the way he used to tie the curtains back just slightly off-center. But what he left behind. That was the part one hadn't prepared for. I ran my hand along the armrest where the scarf had rested earlier. The wood was cool now. Smooth and personal. It made me pause. Like something had been there. But not just something, someone. And not just someone, him, in a way that wasn't his body or voice or hands. Just his having been. Still echoing. And somehow that was heavier than if he'd stayed. Some people walk out, I whispered to no one, but leave behind exactly what makes you never the same again. I folded the scarf as if it might speak. No rush. Just the soft slide of wool on wool, the faint scent of him still clinging to its threads, cedarwood and something I never named. Then I placed it into the valise. Not the usual overnight bag, but the old leather one I hadn't touched in years. The kind meant for real departures. No note. No plan. Just a Monday. The first Monday I had ever left this town without a reason someone else gave me. I didn't tell my sister. She would have asked who I was meeting. And I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't know how to explain that this time. I wasn't going toward someone. I was walking away from what I'd always mistaken as enough. The house was still warm when I closed the door. The teapot still full. The scarf, tucked inside like a secret I no longer needed to carry close to my skin. At the train station I bought a ticket to nowhere specific. Just the next train out. Southbound. Didn't matter where. I just needed motion. The platform smelled of metal and old rain. A child cried somewhere behind me, and a man spoke too loud into his phone. I didn't flinch. I wasn't here to feel delicate anymore. Inside the carriage, the seats were mostly empty. I took one by the window, placed the valise beside me, and sat with my hands in my lap like I used to do in church, quiet, unsure what I believed, but certain I needed to sit through it. And then I saw her. Across the aisle 2 rows down. A woman, maybe my age, maybe younger, it's hard to tell when someone is at peace. She wore a red wool scarf. Same weave. Same color. Same slight fray on one edge, like someone had tugged at it once but changed their mind. She looked up. Met my eyes. She smiled. Not wide. Just enough. I smiled back. We didn't nod. Didn't speak. But something in the glance said, I know. Or maybe I've been. We weren't friends. Weren't sisters. But not strangers either. She turned back to her book. I looked out the window. The town blurred fast. Trees, houses, all familiar outlines washed into a moving painting I no longer belonged to. My chest didn't feel lighter. That was the surprising part. I had expected freedom to feel like flight. But it didn't. It felt like choosing the weight you carry. For once it was mine. Not his. Not Daniel's. Not the weight of silence wrapped in domestic habit. Mine. I rested my palm on the valise. Felt the scarf underneath. Warm still. Or maybe imagined. But does it matter? I didn't choose love, I whispered to myself. Not this time. I chose freedom. Even if freedom still had his scent. Even if I didn't yet know whose face it wore. And maybe that's all right. Maybe naming things too soon is how we lose them. In that moment I realized, some people don't stay. They don't even return. But they leave behind just enough of themselves to remind you that you've already changed. I didn't leave because I was angry. I wasn't running from shame or chasing a fantasy. I left because I'd been sitting in a life that fit everyone but me. And I'd finally grown still enough to hear that truth. I don't owe anyone an apology for that, not anymore. Not for what I did. Not for what I felt. And especially not for wanting more than quiet, clean mornings and a marriage built on polite avoidance. I didn't get swept away. I stepped forward, eyes open, on my own feet. And if there's any sin in that, then let it be the kind that sets a woman free. I used to be the type to whisper my needs into my pillow. A woman who waited for permission, offered in glances, in silences, in what-ifs. But here's what I've learned. You can wait your whole life to be chosen. Or you can choose yourself. And let me tell you something, choosing yourself is not loud. It doesn't come with music swelling or a kiss in the rain. It comes in a train ticket bought in silence. It comes in a scarf folded with care and slipped into your own suitcase. And sometimes it comes in the smile of a stranger, one who wears the same red scarf and doesn't ask questions because she already knows. If any part of this story made you pause just for a second, if you felt yourself somewhere in the middle of it, if you remembered a name you never spoke aloud again, then maybe press like. Not for me. For you. For the parts of you that were never given permission but felt everything anyway. And maybe, just maybe, that will help someone else feel a little less alone with their quiet longing. I never told anyone about that train ride. Not because it was secret, but because it was sacred.